Hi, everyone. Victoria Ali here with everyonecounts.world. I am a life navigator, author of Survival 101, the guidebook to surviving both visible and invisible needs in life, as well as a self-help addict. And to that end, I am so excited to have Sky Tallman today, who is the author of the newly released book, Metro Coalescence, which sounds a bit unusual for something that we'd put on a self-help channel, but what it's really all about is about the way that our cities are created and zoned and the way that we live within our neighborhoods and our communities and how it's working and not working. So it comes down to housing, it comes down to buildings and how they interact with open space. And this has a lot to do with our mental health and our effectiveness. So I'm super excited that we have someone here to talk about something that we don't normally hear about. Sky, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and why you wrote that book?
Hey, Victoria. Thanks for having me on your show today. Yeah, I am an urban planner. I have a background in planning. I was the planner for the city of Trinidad, for the New Mexico Department of Transportation, and most recently for Huerfano County. Now I'm doing some consulting work
And this is in
and
Colorado, correct?
in Colorado.
USA. Okay, go ahead.
I started this book. It started as two papers that I started writing, and it was mostly to solve what I saw as our pressing problem here in this small town. And one of them was looking at how do we accommodate our need for housing within our zoning code without requiring a suburb? How do we deal with becoming a growing and adapting city with what we've already got? That was the question. And what I found was that most of our city was, in a legal sense, finished. It had been built, it was done, and nothing more was really allowed in most parts of the city. And so I made a map, and it's the cover of the book here, and it's a block level density map of the city of Trinidad. And so I measured density at the block level, density being units per acre. And I said, what if the existing conditions determined what your rights are? And your rights are always that you're allowed to do a little bit more than what already exists.
Mm.
And with that question, that sort of incremental approach, if we defined our rights instead of as a glass ceiling, as a cap on what the finished state of our neighborhoods will look like, and instead we asked, what if our neighborhoods are constantly fluctuating,
Mm.
constantly changing? And there's not really a top-down control on what they're going to look like in 20 or 50 or 500 years. What they're going to look like is a function of what people do over time. And what they can do is a little bit more than what they've already got. So to protect people from what they care about, which is drastic change, to protect people from the skyscraper on their cul-de-sac, but not to protect them from absolute change, from any change whatsoever.
And so the current laws dictate a lot of what we can and cannot do, at least in America, with our zoning. And the one thing I'd like to ask you is that how does this affect a person on a personal level? They're living in one of these housing units that has no store, it has no throughways to get to other places. They've got to drive everywhere they go. How does this affect people where they live, or how do they connect with what you're talking about on a personal level?
Oh, there's so many ways. And I think a lot of it is almost invisible. But I think I've heard stories of people saying, I wish my kids could live next to me, but they'll never be able to afford to. And that's not just an accident. That's the way we've designed our real estate market. We've constrained it and we've set rules on it to where we cannot legally meet our need for housing where we already live. We can't add another unit for our kids. We can't add a shop where we need it. And after COVID, all these people are working from home. A lot of us are still working from home. But if we're successful working from home, often we're not allowed to add a couple of employees or expand our business from home.
Right.
As far as how urbanism relates to self-help or to our happiness, it's an integral part of how we build community and how we shape our lives. And there's been a lot of studies out there looking at how things like commutes impact our happiness. And if you could take a 40-minute commute away and instead walk to work, that has about the same impact on your happiness as falling in love. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
so it's
That's
really
empowering.
significant. And then as we think about what it is that we prioritize both in the law and in our built environment, that does give a shape to our lives. So we've put a lot of these funny constraints, like what we're doing and what we're allowed to do, are messily joined.
And so the way that you're talking about changing it or enhancing it is through something in your book called the functional zoning, which we'll get
Yeah, so
into
functional
more. But
zoning
yeah.
is like to treat zoning like a function, like a mathematical function of existing conditions. So as a measurement of what exists, your property or your block would fall into a category that determines your rights as a landowner. And your rights, when I say rights, the intensity or the scale of a project.
Can you tell us just a little bit about? I know you were motivated for some reason to write a book because most of us, like myself, I ended up with a really good life. And I thought, I'm going to write a book so that other people can get there faster than I did to this happy life. But what was your underlying desire when you wrote this? What was your mission, so to speak?
It only became a book at the end. But
Ah,
it started out as really trying to solve a couple of specific little problems. And so the book has a number of different chapters, and the one that I think might make one of the more significant impacts in the world is the idea seeps into our consciousness and into our policies and practices, is this one that I came up with as I was the city planner for Trinidad. And I was trying to solve the housing puzzle.
and what was the
And
crisis as you saw it at the time? Yeah.
we've got this potential for growth. We've got some growth pressure. People are wanting to move here. It's this attractive, beautiful little city. And there just wasn't enough available housing. Well, like we had a mine that was open that employed about 80 people, and most of them were living in a hotel or in
Ah,
hotels. And so we just didn't have the capacity to add 80 jobs. We were fully booked. And so when I looked at the map of the city, I made some interesting maps, and maybe I'll share one with you if you can allow me to
yeah.
share a
And
screen.
for the international crowd, can you explain where Trinidad is? Because there are several, and they
Oh,
might think we're in this in
oh yeah, we've
an
got
island.
no steel drums, no calypso, but we do have some beautiful mountains, and we're right on the southern border, near the border of Colorado and New Mexico on I-25, halfway between Santa Fe and Denver.
Okay.
Okay. So I made a map of the density of each block in the city at the block level.
Wow.
Um,
Now,
and the
density
way,
meaning, can you explain to people what density
so
means?
density in this case, it's very simple. It's just units per acre. So it's like the number of address points per block.
Awesome.
And
Okay.
what's interesting is that we have these concentrations of density in these historical neighborhoods. These
Interesting.
are places that historically, and when you look at them, they have these apartments, they have big old mansions that have been turned into duplexes or triplexes. They have places that used to be shops, and most of those have been converted into homes now. But you have these concentrations of density in these areas that are all currently zoned low density residential. So, from a legal perspective, these neighborhoods in our city that have concentrations of people are finished. And so we are in a little bit of a pickle if we think about a city that's going to last for another 1,000 years. And there's something important about historic preservation. There's something important about recognizing and honoring the character of the neighborhood and not imposing drastic change. Nobody wants a high rise on their cul-de-sac. But what is important is to say that these places where there's these concentrations of people, that's where you'd want to open a business because that's where the people are.
Ah,
That shows that these are neighborhoods that people might want to invest in. And when you have, let's say, in one of these neighborhoods, a dilapidated house, and you say that the law says all you can do is tear it down and replace it with the same kind of house, the same size or the same type, instead of
geez.
saying you've got this falling apart old house, replace it with a duplex or a fourplex,
Mm-hmm.
then all of a sudden, some property that's not worth fixing and it's not worth tearing down becomes a bargain.
Ah,
Um, And that would be really the way to save an old city like Trinidad that has all these 150-year-old houses that are in bad condition. What do you do with them? You have to enable the creation of new value.
And
And when you
so
do that, you also add new neighbors, you create community, you create there's a way of doing that that can maybe disrupt community. And then I think there's also a way of doing that that can empower and enliven community.
And it's funny because I actually grew up in Trinidad. I'm dating myself, but we used to have these little tiny grocery stores in the neighborhoods. And for instance, up on Baca Street and everything, like you said, back in the day, 100 years ago or so, they allowed this type of zoning to occur depending upon what people needed and could walk to or whatever.
We have something like this where you have a big long block, a 1,200-foot block. And
Okay.
the reason I chose 1,200 feet is because it's fairly typical, but there's a threshold around 600 feet where walkability drops off. So
Interesting. Tell us what
blocks that are
walkability is.
300 to 600 feet are very walkable. And if you look at any old part of your city, most of your blocks will be between 300 and 600 feet. You might
Okay.
have the occasional longer block, which as an exception, it's not really a problem. But when it becomes the rule, these long blocks become a barrier to walking. And so where we have these long blocks, largely in suburbs, there may be not really a problem as long as it is what it is. But if that suburb were to grow and evolve into becoming more of an urban neighborhood, those blocks would be a problem. And so what I propose is having what I call functional zoning on the ends of blocks in the first 300 feet, and then just saying, yeah, keep keep limiting development in the middle of the block, kind of keep that as the status quo until you can get some sort of permeation, right? And
Oh,
then
so a
maybe
gap.
a gap that could be a bicycle path, that could be connecting to driveways, that could be going down to the alley, jogging over a property, and then connecting to the other side. So it doesn't have to be a 60-foot wide motorized connection because
See.
long blocks aren't really a barrier for cars, they're a barrier for people. It's perfectly fine to make cars drive longer distances to get around a neighborhood. But when people have to walk longer distances to get around, it breaks up the urban fabric. So that's the idea there. And there's different kinds of ways that this plays out. In some cases, you just have these really long blocks that just create these walls in cities. In other cases, you might have a subdivision that's right in the middle of the city, and they
Hmm.
make a solid line of housing all the way around. And so you have this pod or this closed unit, which means that whoever winds up living here will be neighbors, but not neighbors to this neighborhood. So you get these enclaves. Sometimes you see this with a wealthy neighborhood right next to a poor neighborhood, or
Hmm.
sometimes we'll put a wall like this around a trailer park, literally
Right.
closing people off by class. And then the other thing it does is in a city, like if you live in a place like this and you want to walk to whatever, the nearest center, the only route you can take is along the main street, which is usually the least safe and least attractive place to walk. So there's no parallel connectivity to big arterials or corridors. And without that parallel connectivity, it means that all the bicyclists have to mix with the cars. All the walkers have to take the least attractive, the least safe route, which means that they're just not going to walk or bike. They're going to drive. So it kind of
Right.
creates a transportation pattern that is ultimately the least to the greater good.
Yeah, and it
And
sounds
and
more
so
dangerous, frankly.
yeah,
You've
and
got to
so
get in a car, you've got to drive this 4,000 pound machine, you've got to walk in a place where there's a lot of traffic and it's not very attractive. So that could be dangerous. Cars could really affect people's quality of life.
and I wanted to ask the question too, is one argument for this is that is this more efficient?
Hmm.
Because you're putting all of this space to housing and you're not breaking it up with roads. So maybe you're using less roads per parcel. So this is about how many miles of roads do you have to build to serve 100 people?
Ah,
You know,
okay.
because roads are expensive. And with the roads, you have your sewer and your water and your electric lines, which are also a function of spatial organization. So, what's the length of pipe that we need to support each individual house is a function of density. If you have more people on a block, then you need less pipe per person. Image of the 1890s version of what Barcelona was going to look like. So these are these two courtyard blocks.
Uh-huh.
So these are all the buildings around a courtyard.
Okay.
And so the idea here was that you could have a grid of streets and people would still have access to green space without necessarily having big parks or plazas, but instead having these sort of semi-private courtyards.
Okay. And so within 15 minutes, they could walk over to the courtyard and have access to all types of businesses and green space and
15-minute city is a newer concept that was popularized by the mayor of Paris, Hidalgo. But before the modern era, the 15-minute city was every city. Because
exactly.
it's just like you wouldn't live in a place where it was very inconvenient to do everything. But no, this is what I mean by courtyard. So I just wanted to clarify. So streets take up a lot of our land,
Right.
but we should be looking at sort of an optimum, right? If we want
Hmm.
a wealthy city where we can afford to fix our potholes, then
Right.
we want to be able to make an efficient road network so that the property taxes that we are collecting are going to pay for our roads. But the return is less and less the larger your block gets. So if you had, say, a 3 acre block, your efficiency is going to be not much less than if you have a 6 acre block. And then as you
Right.
go from 6 to 8, as you get longer and longer blocks, you aren't really gaining much. And what you could gain from smaller blocks in walkability, in having more frontage, more space for activity to take place, really does build a wealthier city that makes this marginal gain in efficiency unimportant.
That makes sense.
You got 1 mile of road
Right.
serving 16 people or 1 mile of road serving 600 people. You're really going to be able to fix the potholes on a mile of road that's more efficient and serving more people.
Right. And so basically, the ability for a city to sustainably fix the potholes in some of these subdivisions that
Mhm.
are further out, that have more space in between the lots, bigger lots, this is going to be harder to pay for. And so that might be one of the values we consider when building our cities or changing them is, will it help us be able to afford the maintenance on our streets and infrastructure such as
Mhm.
pipes and electrical? If we increase the density in some of these areas, will it actually help us make it more affordable for everybody? So that's another consideration is, as a value, is it affordable? Is it
Mhm.
sustainable financially?
And so what winds up happening in a lot of cities is that the urban core, the downtown, is so highly productive that it subsidizes the
I
suburbs.
see. But in the case now where a lot of people are leaving the downtowns of some of these bigger cities, now we get into some trouble probably with trying to sustain the maintenance and everything.
Efficiency in urban design is an important thing to think about as we're planning our neighborhoods and we're deciding things about density. Density isn't just an aesthetic quality, it's also what makes a city wealthy. It's also what makes a city possible. If you have a dense neighborhood, then it's easy to imagine on, if, let's say we say on the same block, you have 100 people or you have 14 people. It takes the same length of sewer pipe, it takes the same length of road, it takes the same amount of water pipe to service 100 people or 15 people. And so if we build inefficient neighborhoods, a typical suburban neighborhood, what we currently do is we subsidize that with the productivity and the wealth from the center of the city. But what we could do is maybe just say, hey, if we want to have these inefficient neighborhoods, maybe they should just pay more for all these services. It also costs more to provide fire protection, police protection, to get school buses, to pick kids up,
Right.
to all of the services that we want that make our lives secure and good cost more when we build low density, sprawling urban design. So bringing ourselves together, bringing activities, people living, playing, working in a more compact area makes us all wealthier.
And that goes back to your concept of thinking more of the tiny lot versus the tiny home that is going to have low density. So this is kind of exciting actually to think about the fact that we ourselves could be making these choices for a higher quality of life, for a more affordable way of life. But let me ask you one last question on the sprawling urban phenomenon that's happening in some countries or in America for sure is how does this affect overall the land use or the ecology of the climate?
In a lot of ways, there's been some studies that say that the most efficient house in the suburbs still uses more energy than the least efficient house downtown
Interesting.
because it takes so much energy to go back and forth for all of your errands, for work, for hanging out with a friend, that it really cancels out any sort of efficiency that you might have in your building. So if we're thinking about resilience or sustainability, it costs a lot to live far away from everything. And if we think about low income people in America, it is common for them to spend upwards of 50% of their income on combined housing and transportation. We really need to think about the stress of urban design, not just as housing costs, but housing plus transportation.
Which a lot of us don't think about. But when we were in California, there were many people we talked with that worked at the restaurants and shops that were literally commuting 2 hours each way a day to be there because they couldn't afford to live in those cities. Yet those cities needed their services. And ironically, I noticed there were a lot less choices in those cities for restaurants and shops and things like that. They were tiny versus some of the other cities that I've been in that are more affordable to live in for people. It's more vibrant. Does that make sense? It's
Mhm.
amazing to me. You're sitting in a situation where there's billionaires and millions of dollars in these cities where the workers have to drive 2 hours to get there and 2 hours to leave. And you actually have less choice in those than you do in some of these other communities. So, anyway, I've just seen that personally.
Yeah, and I think if you want to have a community full of artists, you need to have people who can afford to sit around and play their guitar all day and not worry about the exorbitant cost of rent.
And do you see this in bigger cities now today as well? And I don't want to distract you too much, but these newer, sometimes I see newer buildings going up and they might have a little coffee shop in the bottom or
Mhm.
retail and that kind of thing. Do you think that some of these concepts that you're talking about, maybe mixing some commercial in with the residential where you have a lot of people and allowing more density per block if the need arises, do you think that, okay, let's go to Miami, looks good?
Yeah, big cities, small cities. I think maybe what I'm writing about wouldn't apply very smoothly to Manhattan, but I think from the range of a small town to most of our American larger cities, I think it would be a useful concept. Miami, Florida is an interesting place. One of the lists that it made the ranks of is the most likely city to be a 15-minute city, saying that no
Interesting.
matter
What
where you live in
explain
the
a 15?
city,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so it's like no matter where you live in the city, most of your daily needs are within a 15-minute walk or bike ride.
Wonderful.
So you have this mix of uses. And what makes Miami unique is it was like the first large city in America to adopt what's called form-based code and also to eliminate parking standards. The combination of those two things really allowed for Miami's real estate market to keep up with the demand for housing. So as far as big
Interesting.
cities go, it has one of the lowest inflation rates in the country. So it's a big city, it's a rich city, but housing prices haven't doubled and tripled in the same way that they have in a place like Denver, which kind of puts a lot more restrictions on where you can build what. And so form-based code, in theory, says that you should look at the form and the shape and the aesthetics of a building and not at what's happening inside of it.
That's a different way of looking at it versus, okay, all these need to be residential or all these need to be
Right.
commercial. It's so tell me more about the form and why is that important, what a building looks like and how it fits in with its neighboring buildings.
Well, it's a reaction against one part of zoning, which is this. idea of the separation of uses. So if you go to your average American suburb and you look at the law and say, what kind of activities can you do here? It's limited to pretty much just residential. And if you wanted to have an ice cream cart, or if you wanted to convert your garage into an office, or if you wanted to do a number of things that were not just strictly residential, or even sometimes we distinguish between residential and residential based on the number of units. So if there's, you're allowed to have a 1 unit residential house, but not a 2 or a 3 unit residential house, or units per property.
So
And
if you
so
go
even
over 3, maybe it becomes a commercial property or a multifamily, or it's zoned differently. Is that what you're saying?
it comes from our kind of the dark side of our history where we wanted to create segregated cities. And so we said, well, what's the
Oh,
best way to segregate a city without using the language of race or the language of class? Well,
uh-huh.
you require a large lot and a large house. And then all of a sudden, those architectures of affordability, where you share walls and you share roofs, if you make those illegal, then you basically make urban poverty, you exclude it from a neighborhood.
I never thought about how people can actually make real decisions in the real world based on something like zoning laws.
Yeah, so when we wanted to live in a world after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and we said we can't legally segregate schools anymore, but we sure can segregate neighborhoods. And then so a lot of our zoning laws have the shadow of Jim Crow still working through them. And it's actually a pretty effective strategy for segregating cities
Wow.
by
Wow. So
class,
it's
I would
still
say.
at work today, is what you're saying, in many cities, probably not just in America, but across the world.
Yeah, and so my book is an attempt to say, how can we align our laws with our values? If we're going to be a multicultural society, if we're going to be a society that believes in the equality of people, whether they're rich or poor, then how can we legislate our cities
Ah,
according to those values?
that's pretty
And
powerful.
and so if I can share my screen, so like the core tenet of what I'm proposing is that incremental growth is the kind of growth that should be allowed by right. And when I say by right, it means it shouldn't require a political process. Right now, in a lot of cities, you might need a conditional use permit or a special use permit to do something like adding an additional dwelling unit or an ADU to your property. So
Okay.
what that does is it says it's not something you can necessarily do, but we're going to put it before a board of experts and we're going to let them make a one-time decision whether this is okay in this particular context. And what that does is it adds uncertainty and time to the development process. And so if you are a person who wants to buy a property and then fix it up with another unit or two, that's a bad investment in most cities because you have no idea whether you'll even get permission to do it.
Wow.
Um,
That affects people's real lives and
and
affects the
and it means
renters' choices.
and
And
what it means is that if you can't add new growth to your neighborhood as it was built, if you can't add more units, then
Mhm.
where does your city grow? It has to grow on the periphery. And so you force the suburb. And then once that suburb is built and the city continues to grow, what do you need? You need another suburb. So even though what was once the edge of the city is now right in the middle of the city, you still can't build there as if it were in the middle of the city. You still have to treat it as if it were on the edge. And so we
Right.
get these really low density cities, which is, I think, driving this epidemic of loneliness in our culture.
Oh, that's even something
Um,
I hadn't thought of. It's one thing to think about the prices, as you said, if you don't keep up with demand, but loneliness, can you explain that more?
yeah, there's a great book, and there's more than one. One that kind of made a splash in the 1960s was this one called The Feminine Mystique
Mm-hmm.
by Betty Friedan. And she kind of goes into the psychology of living in these bedroom communities as the housewife, as all the men go to work, and then all these women are left there alone in the house, far away from their neighbors. There's nothing to do. There's no coffee shop. There's nowhere to go
Mm.
or nothing to do. And so what do? You go mad.
That's true. So what you're saying is, if there was more of a spirit like Miami has, which is, hey, we're going to allow this organic growth to happen, and to that end, we're going to pass some laws that allow this zoning to be more fluid. Or what would you say?
Santa Fe is an interesting city. I used to live
Okay.
there, and it's got a beautiful 500-year-old downtown. And its architecture, what we love about it, was built on a certain logic, and it happened in a certain way. And so when you look at these old neighborhoods in Santa Fe, you get these interesting, complex buildings and structures. And how they happened was that a family might start off with a room or two. Then, as they grew or if their fortunes increased, they'd add a room.
Ah,
Then they'd maybe have a kid, they'd add another room. And then they'd build up and they'd build out. And so you wind up with this sort of multi generational architecture that incrementally grows over time. And now there's all these historic preservation committees there trying to preserve the architecture. But what we've basically
ah,
made illegal is the process that built that architecture. So the logic that led to this incremental room by room, add bit by bit to your property, that's not really how we regulate our cities anymore. Now we have
wow.
this idea that the finished state has been predetermined. And so
Huh.
what I have here on the screen is what would incremental growth look like? If we start off with the typical suburb, 7 dwelling units per acre, and then we say at each stage, half of the houses or half of the properties add a unit.
Uh-huh.
So we add 7 units a couple of different times. Then people add some backyard units, build up, build out. Then it happens again. Maybe here we encroach on the setback a little bit, so we're getting a little closer to the sidewalk.
Ah,
Maybe here we've got this case where we build one in the backyard and then we attach them, and so we're getting a more complex architecture. And then maybe as things change, by this point, our density has doubled, and by the fourth point, it's tripled. And what would be allowed here is maybe adding a larger project, maybe replacing a single family house with an eightplex.
makes sense.
And so it still looks the same. So density is, we imagine it as being much more of a monster than it is. It's not that visible.
Now, you could even do this in newer subdivisions, like they're from the 1970s or the 80s or even later.
Mhm.
Or if you're going to create a new subdivision.
Yeah, and so this is what it looks like. So this is like the historic part of Trinidad where you've got these houses built before zoning.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you got? You've got this lovely fourplex here. And
Mm-hmm.
it's built right up to the sidewalks. At different times, these bottom units are shops, and at different times, they're residences. These too, like they were built as residences, but they are also at times, I think right now, some of these are actually businesses because they have the architecture that actually lends that flexibility to invite traffic off the sidewalk or just to be a home. You can be either one.
Fantastic.
Here's another example of some historic houses that are built so close to the sidewalk that they wouldn't be allowed today, but they're really part of these great neighborhoods that we have. This is just a middle or lower income row of houses, but it's built right up to the sidewalk and it makes them affordable, nice. You walk down here and you say hi to the folks sitting on their porch. So it not just makes it easy to build on smaller lots and build a nice city, but it builds community too.
Now, this is an
Um,
example. That house on the left is looking a little rough.
yeah,
Of course, I have a real estate background. But so this might be an example of something where even if it was a 100-year-old home, if the demand through industry or whatever was that we needed more density in our town in order to support that growth, then this might be a prospect for tearing down and creating a fourplex or something like that. But yet, hopefully not having to use the newer setback rules to allow people to stay within the theme of the neighborhood.
I think basically, if you did your zoning map like this,
Mm-hmm.
what it is, it's a map that's based on existing condition. If you say that your right to build is that you can add a little bit more intensity to development than what already exists, then if you live in a neighborhood where people are investing and people are moving to and people are building,
Mm-hmm.
then the ceiling moves with what happens. So you never reach a point where you say, oh, we reached our 12 units per acre, we're done.
Ah,
Once you reach
it's fluid.
the next project can push up a little bit higher, a little bit more dense, a little bit more intense. Let's say the scope of what commercial activities you can do increases a little bit. Whereas you say, hey, this a suburban neighborhood that's got big houses on big lots, it makes a lot of sense to say not much else is allowed there. Don't rock the boat there. But what we do instead in our current paradigm is we say, hey, if you want to do a big disruptive project, the best place to do it is outside of town. So
Oh,
Trinidad has a
interesting.
Walmart outside of town, 2.5 miles outside of town. We've got a giant Walmart. Uh, and the thinking was this is this big disruptive project. And so the best place to put it is where it has no neighbors.
People can't even walk there.
Right. And yet you put this big economic center in a place that doesn't support any other economic activity. If you had put the same project downtown, if you
Right.
said existing conditions determine the level of impact, then you'd say,
Hmm.
hey, the existing conditions outside of town don't warrant a big economic center. There's nothing there.
Wow.
Where you should put a big economic activity, a big box store, is right downtown. Then that would probably still be a disruptive project downtown, absolutely. And it would still probably sap some of the life out of some of the local businesses. But instead of drawing traffic away from downtown, you draw it to downtown. So, like the
That's
anchor store in a
fascinating.
mall, like a mall supports a whole bunch of local boutique shops, but what draws people in are these big anchor shops on the end.
That makes
And
a
you're
lot of
you're not going to
sense.
build a mall and put your anchor shops 2 miles away.
When I've been in bigger cities, I've seen quite a few Targets actually put into what used to be a grocery store. They've put a Target and it's close to the college, for instance. I've seen
Mhm.
that like in Fort Collins or Boulder and places that are dealing with this density. So go ahead if you'd like to share some more, but I would like to come back later. This concept that you mentioned of that there could be actual rights or property rights that you could say, hey, I know it hasn't been done before, but this area has grown in the past, or this 100-year-old
Mhm.
pattern was that people were able to add on. I'd like to add on. And you'd probably have better luck if you went to the zoning district for this kind of thing in an area that can support it, whether it's commercial or a residence or a multifamily, versus if you go to an existing suburb now that has single homes but absolutely no ADUs. Yeah, and those
Uh,
poor people in those remote urban centers, such as the Feminine Mystique author said, a lot of times it's you've got to get in your car to go anywhere. And that's not good for the environment. It's not good for the socializing or whatever. This is breakthrough thinking that you're saying to go back to some of the traditional wisdom.
what you can do, and I think this is, I'll shift topics a little bit here and talk a little bit about one of the chapters in my book, which is about plazas. And plazas are something that American cities tend to do particularly poorly. And even in the Southwest, where we have these old Spanish plazas, I think we have to understand the Spanish plaza as an experiment for its time. And it was a radical departure from what the older medieval cities in Europe looked like. And I made this map and it gave me an aha moment. I was drawing this map of Salzburg, Austria, which is just a beautiful old city. And I was mapping all the plazas in the city. That's this map. And what you see when you look at this map is that you can walk from one edge to the other of downtown and be in a plaza almost the whole way.
Now, can you explain a plaza to people that may not have had a lot of exposure?
Yeah, a plaza is probably most analogous to a pedestrianized street. It's a place where you've got a bunch of activity on all sides and cars can get in if they want, but it's not really a space for cars.
Aha. So
Uh,
if they need to deliver something to a shop or fix somebody's hot water heater, they can get in. But for the most part,
mhm.
plazas are not really geared towards cars.
Yeah, and there's some exceptions. In some plazas, there might be roads for cars on one or two sides.
Hmm.
Sometimes Santa Fe, you've got roads on all four sides, but they usually close the traffic on one or two. And so you have different iterations of what that looks like. In the colonial world, the plaza was really this symbolic center of power where you bridged the church and the state. And so
Interesting.
you have on one side your civic building, on the other side your religious, and then on either side, commerce or other things. So a plaza is really as much of a aesthetic space as it is an economic space, where you put activities. And you want to have your big anchor institutions, your post office, your library, your office buildings, your things that are going to draw a consistent crowd, maybe at different times of day. And then what that supports is little boutique shops, your little cafe or your coffee shop. Feed on this necessary traffic of these larger institutions, hotels, things like that. And then we certainly dedicate space to something. In the US, we don't really have a difference in our zoning laws between parks, plazas, and open space. We just treat them all as the same thing, but they're really distinct things. So I make the case that those are distinct in my book. And what we see here on the right is how much space do we dedicate to parking? And in a nice walkable city like Salzburg, it's not much. There's some surface parking, but it's not much. And if we look at just a typical sprawly American city, which is
Ah,
Scotts, it's an ocean of parking. And the laws in Scottsdale for parking are absolutely mind-boggling. If you have a restaurant, you need, oh, I don't know if I can rattle it off the top of my head, but you need more than 1 to 1 in terms of floor space to parking space. Or if you have a bar, I think you need 80 square feet of parking for each square foot of, or eight.
so they are
This,
basing whether you can have your business or not as to whether you have access to the amount of parking that you need
right.
or not. Let me ask you this, back in Salzburg, is this the example of where you could walk across this place, at least from plaza to plaza? You can basically go to a grocery store, or 15 minutes you can get to a restaurant or something. And it's
Mhm.
geared more towards the concept of walking and biking versus cars. So that's a very different mindset.
So the landlord in Scottsdale cannot ask the question, could I make more money off this property as a parking lot or as an apartment?
Hmm.
That question is basically foreclosed upon because if you've got a little shop and you've got your parking lot and your parking lot serves your shop, and you cannot say, could I make more money if I converted this parking lot into something more useful? So it means that you can't meet the needs of the community because the law says that parking is what the community needs.
Wow. So you're basically talking about two things, it sounds like. Number one is thinking about freedom as to how to use your property and what's the highest and best use of that property. But also, is it the cart driving the horse, so to speak, for the law to be making these
Yeah,
decisions?
yeah. So it does have this feedback loop where you build a place for cars and then all of a sudden everyone's getting there by car. And so they want their conveniences, their cheap and accessible parking that's right next to where they want to go. And then you build that and then it spreads things out because you need to have all that space for parking. And so then people wind up living further away and then they have to come in by their car and then they need more space for parking and then you do get this kind of insane feedback loop. But I think the most important first step that cities can make, and cities are doing it across the country, are getting rid of parking requirements. So this is a movement that's taking hold. It's gaining a lot of popularity. But you just need to allow landowners to make decisions that make sense for them. Rather than dictating that parking is a social value, you say parking is a piece of real estate.
Okay, so the mindset shifts. So
Because
takes
parking is
the
expensive. If you want to have a covered parking space, it might cost you $30,000 to $40,000.
right.
So it's not insignificant. And when you think of like the cost of parking to urban affordable housing, that can add 20, 30, 40% onto your housing project.
Absolutely.
Anyway, this is just exemplifying the city from which Columbus sailed and the cities that Spain built in the New World and the distribution of plazas.
So essentially, when was this, in the 1600s or something? On the left,
Yeah,
Barcelona, or older,
yeah.
of course. So a lot more plazas, and you can get from plaza to plaza, which these plazas probably were central to having little shops and things like that as well, more
Mhm.
dispersed. And so then when they came to the New World, why do
They
you
said,
think they
let's
shifted? Yeah,
well,
they would have one central
there was this
plaza.
sort of Renaissance idea about rationality. And if you can put people in a rational street grid, then they're going to behave less uncivilized. And so we can rationalize society, then we can get the more perfect world.
And this is what
So it was this kind of bizarre philosophy, but it worked out in giving us grids.
that makes sense. I always wondered how that happened and why that happened.
One of the challenges we face is like, how do we retrofit suburbia? How do we take these places and make them incrementally better?
When you say
Um,
better, what do you mean by better? Yeah, because we've gone through it, but let's review.
so more like a traditional old world city. So one thing that makes the United States unique in the world is that we're the only country to have the concept of like complete separation of uses. So where residential means only residential.
Interesting.
Nobody else on earth does that. It does happen. Like you get, even if it's not the law, you do get residential neighborhoods. Those definitely do happen.
Uh-huh.
All, you don't have to require them for them to exist. But radical separation is something that's unique to us. And so I think if you imagine, though, just removing that requirement from the law, you still don't have a good architecture of streets and roads to support anything other than low density suburban neighborhoods in the suburban street grid layout. Because you don't have a grid, you have these really long blocks, winding roads that in a network that was built specifically not to get people places. And so when you look at our cul-de-sac neighborhoods, those street networks were made in order to discourage through traffic. So they're intentionally inefficient networks.
So basically, what you're telling me, again, as we could see that neighborhoods were built in the past in order to reflect the values of the times or whatever,
Mhm.
what values are being reflected when they create these subdivisions that have no through traffic? And I've seen these sometimes in more expensive
Well,
neighborhoods as well.
I think it comes out of a critique of the industrial city at the turn of the century, where you had a Charles Dickens kind of scenario, where you had your downtown with coal burning industries right downtown, polluting the air. You had tenement dwelling conditions, which were these awful conditions that were happening in the city. And you had this concentration of urban poverty. And really, we hadn't developed ways of dealing with it. The industrial city at the turn of the century had a lot of things worth criticizing. It was a little bit off in some
Uh-huh.
ways. Um, and so there was a movement to say, how should we live? If not like this, then how? And so as transportation technologies were improving, there was this push to say we want a slightly more bucolic life. We want to live a little bit closer to nature. We want to have our yard. That's a solution to the polluted, congested downtown with crowded, cramped living conditions.
So the people
And
that
so
could
there was,
afford it, that's why they moved to the suburbs or created the suburbs, was so that they could have that little patch of green or
yeah.
whatever.
And it was this kind of utopian, idealistic movement on how do we solve the problem of the city at that time.
Hmm.
And for whatever it's worth, that was the utopian thinking of the time, right?
Absolutely. Uh-huh.
And then along with that, in order to make it this refuge from the city, we banned all the things of the city. So we
Ah.
said anything that would bring the working class to us, we don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's make
Mm-hmm.
a neighborhood that nobody will ever enter unless they live here. So let's make
Okay.
sure jobs, there's no working class,
There's no store.
there's no stores, there's nothing that's going to bring the rats.
Do you think that was
Um,
based on fear? Like you said, those were the values of the time. Where do you think we are now with some of this? Does this still happen where it still seems like that's pretty common, at least in America?
yeah, it is. And I think what's happened is what started as a social project has become an aesthetic project. So people who will defend setbacks or single family neighborhoods will defend it on aesthetic grounds. It looks the way I like things to look. And
Organized, neat.
I ignore the fact that there's like this social consequence to protecting them.
Hmm.
So I think for the most part, we protect these things for, you know, nice reasons, more or less on the surface, but there's still like this element of it that has these like social outcomes. Like we've built ourselves into unaffordable housing. It didn't just happen.
I see what you're saying is it's not just a supply and demand like a lot of people in real estate are saying that there's a deficit of housing, at least in this country or in certain parts of the world, because there are just more people that need the housing or whatever, that it's just not available. So it's a supply and demand issue. But what you're saying is that without realizing it, we've partially created this crisis by the way in which we're building our neighborhoods and our housing and the values that we followed for that. And as a result, what's interesting is because of COVID or whatever, a lot of people started working from home. And so suddenly these big cities with these tall office buildings are becoming vacant, or people are leaving those big cities in some ways. Do you see an opportunity here with these big cities maybe going through some crises with having a lot of people, maybe even some of the people that are houseless, coming in there and living in their tents and everything? What do you see happening? It's scary right now in some ways to see this. The rich getting richer in some ways, and the middle class falling into some poverty here and there. Do you see any opportunities there with the changes going on that could be helpful?
I think we as a people are good at solving problems. And I think one thing that has happened as a result of the struggle with housing and with homelessness and things like that is that it is one of the few areas of bipartisan consensus.
Ah,
We agree that when we look at the world we live in, there is in fact a problem with our housing market. And so at least we can agree on that. And I think that's the starting place to coming up with creative solutions, is recognizing the problem and agreeing that it is a problem, despite the fact that we maybe could have avoided it 50 years ago if we had
right.
taken a different route, but we didn't, right? So here we are. And I think people are coming up with really interesting creative solutions all over the country. And I think what I'm proposing here is not the whole pie, but
Sure.
it's one slice of that puzzle of how you create a pressure release valve on the market. And the real estate market is anything but a free market. It is so highly controlled as to where you can put what and what can be done where, that when we look at it, it's very distorted by what you're allowed to do. And so if you're going to think about where you want to put a house, the first question you ask isn't where do people need houses? It's where can I put a house?
And so, how could you, as a homeowner or a home buyer, or even a renter or a landlord that owns several units, how can you think more about, hey, maybe something else would be good here, or I have an idea for this? And can you go to your local zoning board and apply for variances? Or can you say, hey, can we experiment in this neighborhood with something
So
that Sky's talking about here?
what's happening all over the country, and I think California, Oregon are really leading the way in a lot of ways, is that we're raising the ceiling. We're upzoning. We're saying that if your property is within a quarter mile of transit, then you can build up to, in California, up to 40 units per acre there.
Wow.
Or in Oregon, they said if you have a property that was zoned single family, depending on the size of your city, you can now build duplexes or fourplexes. And so we are recognizing the pickle we've put ourselves in and we are raising the ceiling. So that is happening. And what I'm proposing in the short term would be very similar. In the short term, it would be analogous. It would be the same thing. It would raise the ceiling. But in the long term, it would make that ceiling fluctuate and flex with what happens.
Ah,
So instead of being in a position where in 20 or 50 years, you have to go through another political process of saying, oh, we've built up to the limit again. We need to raise the ceiling again. You would have that fluctuating ceiling that would keep up with the times. So in one sense, it's kind of part of a national movement. Whether you
right.
like it or not, it's probably coming to where you're at, whether it's in the form of just expanding people's property rights, or if it's in the form of something like I'm proposing, functional zoning, or if it's some new creation of some new imagination of how we can regulate our cities. But it's happening. It's a big movement.
And it sounds like buildings like Walmart in our little town if they would have come downtown, they would have probably turned it into more of a historic looking building or something to fit with the motif. But this would be something that would be a magnet for the town versus
I don't think they would have done that unless they were made to do that.
interesting.
Like Santa Fe has this sort of vernacular requirement, and I do address that sort of vernacular, the architectural style in my book. And it's a chapter at the end. It's called Vernacular Resonance. And the idea is that aesthetics do matter. And I think it's a little bit of a, I'm not completely sure if that's a universal claim that I can make or that if everybody listening will buy that. But I think I will claim that aesthetics do matter. And that the reason why you don't want a fourplex on the end of your single family block is because you have this image in your mind of what that's going to look like. And you say, I imagine the apartment as being the architecture of poverty. I imagine the apartment as being something that will bring some other social consequence. And so I think as we talk about increasing people's rights to build more units or increase density or increase the range of activity, the aesthetics of what that's going to look like is part and partial to how it gets sold and how it gets accepted. And so what I
Right.
have is this idea called vernacular resonance, which is to say in any town, whether it's Trinidad or Santa Fe, it would look different in either place, but you take an inventory of historically relevant styles. You could take that as a broad inventory or a narrow inventory, or one neighborhood might have one set of historically relevant styles and another different. So there's different ways you could play with this, but you say that for a new project, you have a point list, a checklist, referencing elements of that style in a new project. So you're not creating historical architecture, but you're putting historical reference into your architecture. And with that, it gives the opportunity to ensure that there's consideration for really important things in a building, like how does it relate to the street? Does it have a front door that faces a parking lot behind the building, or does it have a front door that interacts with the sidewalk? And that's a really important question in terms of what your city is going to look like in 20 or 50 or 100 years. If every project contributes a little bit to the sidewalk, contributes a little bit to public space, and incorporates some vertical and horizontal lines that draw your eye and make you recognize that they're part of a historical conversation in your city. I think that's the solution. That's going to change the bias with which we look at modern architecture from being an out of place element in a historic community to being something that's in communication with the historicity of the community.
And yet still changing with the times. If
Yep.
a store is needed here for the people to be able to walk 15 minutes to get there, or if it needs more density because of the jobs and these people don't want to have a yard, so they'd rather have condos or townhomes or something. It just really sounds like you have come up with something here that comes from some historical reference, but it's also some ideas you're pulling together, just seeing what's worked and what hasn't worked. And that there are ways that we as individuals can participate in the conversation and not just wait around for these laws to change, but to educate ourselves and to be thinking, do I want to live in a world where it's like, what would be the best use and where do I want to do my business and what makes sense versus what are the existing zoning laws and how much hassle is it going to take for me to be able
Right.
to do this?
So the thing about the law is that it's something that we make and it's something that should reflect our collective values.
Right.
And I think it's always an important question to say, whether we're talking about zoning or criminal justice or any other law, to say, is this law connected to our values?
And be
Is it,
clear about those values.
and what values are there, right? Is it an aesthetic law? And if it is, does it have social consequences? And are those balanced?
That makes sense. And is there anything else that you wanted to share that we haven't so far? Any other slides or any other concepts? Because we have this rare opportunity with you to have this conversation.
Well, I guess maybe I'll end on this note. Functional zoning is one of the main paradigms that I'm proposing. Metro coalescence is this idea of how do we bring our cities together? And I'll end with a little passage.
That would be fantastic.
The urban fabric, the interwovenness of a city's people and places, is held together by a kinetic bond that any observer can sense when a place is working. It is more than just density or happenings. It is more than architecture and economic activity. It is the warp and woof of the urban fabric, the canvas of city life. When tightly woven, it composes a coherent whole. If it is too full of holes, it falls apart and lands in the rag pile of unmemorable places. The
Mm.
threshold at which the urban fabric falls apart is that point at which the flaneur turns around. It can be recognized not by a single gap, but when the pattern of gaps between buildings and entryways becomes too frequent and too large. It is that point in which the visual impact of the street loses its ability to make the walker wonder what might be seen should he or she walk a little further.
Mm.
It is the sidewalk that stretches out to a lonely vanishing point, like a tightrope between the chasm of moving traffic and an abyss of parking. The threshold can be recognized when the gaps between active facades fragment the field of vision and disperse the energy needed to hold the walkable city together. With widening frontages, the urban fabric very quickly turns to tatters. When the visual continuity of the wall of facades along the street is interrupted with empty space, parking lots, dead walls, fences, or hostile landscaping. And so I think one of the things that's been a big movement that's gotten a lot of attention and popularity is tiny houses.
Hmm.
What I would like to see gain traction is tiny lots. I think
Ah.
that might be a little bit more impactful in really improving not just affordability of housing, but the quality of urbanism.
So shifting the thinking from tiny homes to tiny lots. And that brings
Mhm.
up a whole different canvas
Yeah.
in a whole different way of looking at things and interplaying with the lots next to you, the sidewalk. And you talk a lot about the sidewalk in the way
Mhm.
that you write. And so what you're discussing is kind of like city planning for the soul. There's chicken soup for the soul, but this is city planning for the soul.
I
And
like that.
and in addition, it's like, how do each one of us play a part in this? It's exciting what you're talking about. It's revolutionary. It's fun. It seems to go along with the environmental concerns and the social. And as you said, do you really want to spend an hour and a half on the highway every day in traffic trying to get from here to there as well? When in fact, maybe we can do things a little differently in the way that we're developing our communities so that we don't have to be in the car in general as much and we can get back to some of this walkability, this connection with people and using our resources in a way of the planet that's more sustainable is what I'm hearing too.
Yeah, these are all kind of new, untested ideas.
Hmm.
It's a very theoretical book. And so I am looking forward to the feedback, whether it tears them down and reshapes them or whether it takes them to a new level or puts them into practice. Whether or not this is a complete solution or a complete idea that people will adopt, I think it's going to definitely help the conversation focus on the right things.
And if you or somebody just listening who's a homeowner, a renter, and a landlord, what can you do from your standpoint to contribute to this functional zoning way of thinking and maybe even heading more towards these tiny lots? What can you yourself do to change your life? We spend a lot of time in our homes in such a way that will participate in this change because people might be afraid of this change.
Absolutely. I've got little philosophical bits on how to think about change and our relationship to change. And I think for the average person who might read this, I think it might help just shape the way, that lens through which they see the city. And I think that in itself is a significant thing. So whether or not you're empowered to rewrite laws or to push the envelope on how we govern ourselves, I think how you see your surroundings is the important first step. And that can lead to conversations, that can lead to advocacy, that can lead to changing how we describe the problems that we're trying to solve.
That's fantastic how we're framing the problems in general.
Mm-hmm.
So by each person who watches this video can be having an extra set of eyes out there to see what's happening in my city, what's happening in my community. Do I feel the values are being supported that I want to support? And can I have some conversations with like-minded people, maybe talk to a property owner and say, hey, have you considered this? Like, for instance, we have a gas station down the street from where I am. And I keep telling every owner that goes in there, every tenant, I say, you know what? Instead of doing like car repair in the middle of our small town, why don't you convert this to a diner? I really think it would attract a lot of help with the sidewalk and help with the real needs that the people have that are living downtown. And so it's neat. But let me ask you this, where can people follow you? Because you sound like a thought leader in this arena and a breath of fresh air. So where can people, first of all, buy your book of Metro Coalescence? And then secondly, just follow you or get in touch with you or
The book is a paperback, and the Kindle version is currently up on Amazon.
hey, can people follow you on LinkedIn? Can I
Oh,
put your
yes.
LinkedIn connection up there? Okay, all you large and small city planning departments, jump on this because the average citizen is going to, take advantage. Thank you so much. It's been so exciting and refreshing and fun and hopeful, frankly. And this is a different message that's going out around housing and commercial use and empowerment. So thank you for your time. And I really look forward to reading more of the book myself. I've just gone through some of it, but also telling everybody I know to take a moment to reflect on what you're trying to bring to our awareness. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Sky.
Victoria. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.